The Calculus of Peace, Leibniz's Quest to Solve World Conflict Through Logic, Chapter 1. A spark of inspiration, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz gazed out the window of his study in Hanover, his mind swirling with possibilities. It was the summer of 1686, and the 40-year-old philosopher and mathematician found himself captivated by a singular idea, one that he believed could change the course of human history. As court counselor to the Duke of Brunswick, Leibniz was acutely aware of the religious and political conflicts tearing Europe apart. The 30 Years' War had ravaged the continent just a few decades earlier, leaving millions dead. Now, tensions were rising once again between Catholic and Protestant powers. Leibniz sighed heavily as he considered the seemingly intractable nature of human disagreement. If only there was a way to resolve disputes through pure reason rather than violence, he thought. And then, like a bolt of lightning, inspiration struck. What if it was possible to create a universal language of logic, a symbolic system that could express any concept or argument with mathematical precision? With such a system, errors in reasoning could be detected as easily as errors in arithmetic. Conflicts could be resolved through careful analysis rather than bloodshed. Leibniz's heart raced as he began to sketch out his vision. He would develop a calculus ratiocinator, a calculus of reason. By reducing logic to a set of symbols and rules for manipulating them, he could create a powerful new tool for deriving truth. With this universal characteristic, Leibniz muttered excitedly to himself, we could put an end to all controversies. Disputing philosophers would simply sit down at a table and say, let us calculate. The philosopher grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and began furiously writing out equations and diagrams. He knew he was onto something profound, perhaps the key to lasting peace and harmony among nations. Little did he realize that this spark of inspiration would consume the rest of his life, leading him on an epic intellectual quest with the loftiest of goals: to solve the problem of human conflict once and for all through the power of logic. Leibniz's quill scratched across the page late into the night as the first components of his grand vision began to take shape. A new era of reason was about to dawn, and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz would be its champion. Chapter 2. The Language of Thought. Leibniz's fingers were stained with ink as he hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. It was now 1688, 2 years since his initial spark of inspiration, and the philosopher had thrown himself fully into developing his universal characteristic. He reached for a well-worn copy of Aristotle's Prior Analytics, flipping through the yellowed pages. Leibniz had always been fascinated by the Greek philosopher's system of syllogisms, a method of logical argument using deductive reasoning. But where Aristotle had used words, Leibniz envisioned numbers. Every concept, he muttered to himself, can be broken down into its simplest components, and each of these primitive concepts can be assigned a unique number. Leibniz scribbled furiously in his notebook. Man equals 2, mortal equals 3, Socrates equals 5. He then began to manipulate these numbers, multiplying and dividing them to represent different logical operations. In his mind's eye, he could see complex chains of reasoning reduced to elegant mathematical equations. But as he worked, a nagging doubt crept in. Was he truly capturing the nuances of human thought with these simple numbers? How could he account for the subtle shades of meaning in language? Frustrated, Leibniz pushed back from his desk and began to pace. His eyes fell upon a Chinese text he had recently acquired, an ancient system of divination called the I Ching. The book used combinations of broken and unbroken lines to represent different states of being. Suddenly, a new idea began to form. What if, instead of numbers, he used a binary system of ones and zeros to represent his primitive concepts? This would allow for far more combinations and nuance. Excited once again, Leibniz rushed back to his desk and began a new set of calculations. He was getting closer, he could feel it, but there was still so much work to be done. As the candle on his desk burned low, Leibniz finally looked up and realized it was well past midnight. He rubbed his tired eyes, knowing he should rest, but his mind was still racing with possibilities. Just a bit longer, he told himself, dipping his quill in ink once more. I'm on the verge of something truly revolutionary. Little did Leibniz know that his quest to create a universal language of thought would consume him for decades to come. leading him down unexpected paths and bringing him into conflict with some of the greatest minds of his age. But in that moment, hunched over his desk in the flickering candlelight, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz felt closer than ever to unlocking the secrets of human reason itself. Chapter 3. A royal audience. The grand halls of Herrenhausen Palace echoed with Leibniz's footsteps as he made his way to meet Sophia of Hanover. It was the summer of 1696, and the philosopher had been summoned to present his progress on the universal characteristic to the electress. Leibniz smoothed down his wig and adjusted his cravat, acutely aware of the stakes. Sophia was not only his patron, but also one of the most intellectually curious royals in Europe. Her support could be crucial in bringing his vision to fruition. As he entered the electress's study, Leibniz was struck by the sight of Sophia hunched over a complex mathematical problem, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he approached, a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Ah, Herr Leibniz," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I've been eagerly anticipating your visit. Tell me, how progresses your grand project?" Leibniz took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your Highness, I believe I'm on the cusp of a breakthrough. My system of universal symbols is taking shape, allowing for the expression of any concept or argument with mathematical precision." He pulled out a sheaf of papers covered in intricate diagrams and equations. Sophia leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Fascinating," she murmured. "And you truly believe this could be used to resolve conflicts?" "Indeed, Your Highness," Leibniz replied, his voice growing passionate. "Imagine a world where disagreements could be settled not through violence, but through careful calculation, where the truth of any proposition could be determined with certainty." Sophia nodded thoughtfully, but then her expression turned skeptical. "It's an admirable goal, Herr Leibniz. But how do you account for the complexities of human emotion and cultural differences? Can these truly be reduced to symbols and equations?" Leibniz faltered for a moment. It was a question that had haunted him in his quieter moments of doubt. I believe they can, Your Highness. With a sufficiently robust system, even the most nuanced human experiences could be expressed logically." The electress regarded him silently for a long moment, then smiled. "Well, I look forward to seeing the results of your continued work. You have my support in this endeavor." Relief washed over Leibniz. As he left the palace, his mind was already racing with new ideas sparked by Sophia's probing questions. He would need to refine his system further, accounting for the full spectrum of human experience. As he climbed into his carriage for the journey home, Leibniz felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, but with the electress's backing, he was one step closer to realizing his dream of a universal language of reason. Little did he know that his greatest challenges and fiercest rivalries still lay ahead. The quest to solve world conflict through logic was far from over. Chapter 4. The calculus controversy. The year was 1699, and Leibniz's study in Hanover was a maelstrom of papers, books, and hastily scribbled notes. The philosopher had made significant progress on his universal characteristic, but a new storm was brewing on the horizon, one that threatened to derail his life's work. Leibniz picked up a recent issue of the Acta Eruditorum, the scientific journal he had founded years earlier. His eyes narrowed as he read a thinly veiled accusation from supporters of Isaac Newton, claiming that Leibniz had plagiarized the English scientist's work on calculus. "Preposterous," Leibniz muttered, his hands shaking with anger. He had developed his version of calculus independently, publishing his findings in 1684, 2 decades before Newton's Principia Mathematica. Yet now his integrity was being called into question. As he paced the room, Leibniz's mind raced. This controversy could not have come at a worse time. His work on the universal characteristic relied heavily on his calculus innovations. If his reputation was tarnished, would anyone take his grand vision seriously? A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. It was Johann Bernoulli, a brilliant young mathematician and one of Leibniz's most ardent supporters. "Herr Leibniz," Bernoulli said, his face grave, "have you seen the latest salvos from Newton's camp? They're demanding you reveal your early notes on calculus." Leibniz sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 53 years. "And if I cannot produce them," he asked quietly. Bernoulli's silence was answer enough. Leibniz had developed much of his early work on calculus mentally, jotting down only the key results. Now, that very brilliance was being used against him. We must respond forcefully, Bernoulli urged. Your universal characteristic could change the world. We can't let this dispute derail everything. Leibniz nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. He turned to his desk and began to write, crafting a careful defense of his work. As the quill scratched across the paper, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This calculus controversy was more than just a petty academic squabble. It was a battle for the future of reason itself. If Leibniz could not defend his mathematical innovations, how could he hope to create a universal language of logic? As night fell, Leibniz worked tirelessly, knowing that the outcome of this dispute could determine the fate of his life's work. The path to solving world conflict through logic had taken an unexpected and treacherous turn, but Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was determined to see it through to the end. Little did he know that this controversy would consume years of his life, drawing him into a bitter feud with one of the greatest scientific minds of the age. The quest for a universal characteristic was about to face its greatest test yet. Chapter 5. The Berlin Academy. The year was 1700, and Leibniz found himself in Berlin, standing before Frederick I, the newly crowned king in Prussia. Despite the ongoing calculus controversy, Leibniz had been summoned to discuss an ambitious new project, the establishment of a Prussian Academy of Sciences. Your Majesty, Leibniz began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. I propose an academy that will not only advance scientific knowledge, but also serve as a testament to the power of reason in resolving conflicts. Frederick leaned forward, intrigued. Go on, Herr Leibniz. How do you envision this academy achieving such lofty goals? Leibniz's eyes gleamed with passion. By bringing together the greatest minds from across Europe, regardless of national or religious differences. Through collaborative research and debate, we can demonstrate the universal nature of truth and reason. As he spoke, Leibniz's mind raced with possibilities. The academy could be the perfect testing ground for his universal characteristic. Here, scholars could work together to refine and apply his system of logical symbols. Frederick nodded thoughtfully. An admirable vision, Herr Leibniz. But how do we ensure that this academy doesn't become mired in the same petty disputes that plague other scientific institutions? Leibniz smiled, having anticipated this question. That, Your Majesty, is where my work on a universal language of logic comes into play. By providing a common framework for expressing and evaluating ideas, we can cut through misunderstandings and focus on the essence of any disagreement. The king's eyes widened with interest. A bold claim, indeed. And you believe this? Universal characteristic of yours can truly bridge the gaps between different schools of thought? I do, Your Majesty, Leibniz replied with conviction. It is my life's work, and I believe it holds the key to lasting peace and progress. After a moment of contemplation, Frederick nodded decisively. Very well, Herr Leibniz. You shall have your academy. I appoint you as its first president. Show me what this new age of reason can achieve. As Leibniz left the royal presence, his mind was already buzzing with plans. The Berlin Academy would be his greatest opportunity yet to put his ideas into practice on a grand scale. But as he climbed into his carriage, a familiar doubt gnawed at him. The calculus controversy still loomed large, threatening to undermine his credibility. And the task of translating his complex system of logic into practical applications seemed more daunting than ever. Leibniz gazed out at the bustling streets of Berlin, a city poised on the cusp of enlightenment. He had been given a great responsibility and an unprecedented opportunity. Now, he would have to prove that his vision of a world governed by reason was more than just a philosopher's dream. As the carriage pulled away, Leibniz steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The Berlin Academy would be his legacy, a testament to the power of logic in solving the world's conflicts. But first, he would have to navigate the very human world of politics, rivalries, and competing interests that threatened to tear his dream apart before it could even begin. Chapter 6. The Twilight of Reason. The year was 1714, and Leibniz sat alone in his study, surrounded by the accumulated papers and books of a lifetime. At 68 years old, the once vibrant philosopher felt the weight of time pressing down upon him. He picked up a letter from the Royal Society in London, his hands trembling slightly as he read its contents. The verdict was in. Newton had been declared the sole inventor of calculus. Leibniz's name would be forever tarnished by accusations of plagiarism. All those years of work, he muttered bitterly, reduced to a footnote in another man's legacy. But it wasn't just the calculus controversy that gnawed at him. Leibniz's grand vision of a universal characteristic, a logical language to solve all conflicts, remained frustratingly out of reach. The Berlin Academy, which he had founded with such high hopes, had become mired in political infighting and petty disputes. Leibniz shuffled through his notes on the characteristic, pages and pages of symbols and equations that had once seemed so promising. Now, they looked like the scribbling of a madman. How could he have believed that the complexities of human conflict could be reduced to mere logical formulas? A knock at the door roused him from his melancholy. It was his longtime friend and confidant, Caroline of Ansbach, soon to become Queen of Great Britain. "My dear Leibniz," she said, her face etched with concern, "I've come to see how you fare. There are rumors." Leibniz waved his hand dismissively. "Rumors of my decline, no doubt. Perhaps they are not entirely unfounded." Caroline sat beside him, her eyes falling on the scattered papers. "Your work on the characteristic, surely you haven't abandoned it?" Leibniz sighed heavily. "I fear, my dear Caroline, that I have been chasing a dream. The world is not ready for such a system. Perhaps it never will be." "But think of all you have accomplished," Caroline urged. "Your work in mathematics, in philosophy, you've changed the way we understand the world." Leibniz nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Perhaps, but I had hoped for so much more. I wanted to end conflict, to bring about a new age of reason. Instead, I find myself embroiled in petty academic disputes." Caroline placed a comforting hand on his arm. "The seeds you have planted will bear fruit long after we are gone, my friend. Your ideas will live on." As Caroline took her leave, Leibniz turned back to his desk. He picked up a quill, dipped it in ink, and began to write. It was not the universal characteristic he had dreamed of, but a simpler document, his last will and testament. As the candle burned low, Leibniz reflected on his life's work. He had not solved the problem of world conflict as he had hoped, but perhaps, in his quest for a universal language of reason, he had laid the groundwork for future generations to build upon. With a heavy heart but a glimmer of hope, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz put his quill to paper, determined to set down his final thoughts for posterity. The dream of a world governed by pure reason might have faded, but the journey had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Legacy of Logic, November 14th, 1716. A cold, gray day in Hanover. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, once the toast of Europe's intellectual circles, now lay on his deathbed, largely forgotten by the world he had sought to change. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of his life's work flashed before his eyes. The universal characteristic, the calculus controversy, the Berlin Academy, all seemed like distant dreams now. In his final moments of lucidity, Leibniz whispered to his nurse, "Bring me paper and ink. There is still so much to write, to calculate." But it was too late. The great philosopher's quill had scratched its last equation. News of Leibniz's passing spread slowly through Europe. In London, Isaac Newton allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. In Berlin, the academy Leibniz had founded carried on without him, his grand vision already fading from memory. And yet, as the years passed, something remarkable began to happen. Leibniz's ideas, scattered like seeds across the continent, began to take root and flourish in unexpected ways. In the salons of Paris, philosophers debated Leibniz's concept of the best of all possible worlds, sparking new ways of thinking about optimism and theodicy. In the universities of Germany, mathematicians built upon Leibniz's work in symbolic logic, laying the groundwork for the computer age centuries later. And in the corridors of power across Europe, diplomats and statesmen began to see the value in Leibniz's dream of resolving conflicts through reason and dialogue rather than force of arms. As the Enlightenment dawned, Leibniz's quest for a universal language of logic took on new life. Though his specific system was never realized, the idea of using reason to bridge divides and solve global problems became a driving force in Western thought. 2 centuries after Leibniz's death, a young mathematician named Kurt Gödel would build upon his work in logic to revolutionize our understanding of mathematical truth. And in the halls of Manchester University, Alan Turing would draw inspiration from Leibniz's binary system to help create the first modern computers. In the 21st century, as artificial intelligence and machine learning reshape our world, echoes of Leibniz's grand vision can still be heard. His dream of a universal language to solve all conflicts may have been overly optimistic, but his belief in the power of logic and reason to improve the human condition lives on. As twilight falls on Hanover, a solitary figure stands before Leibniz's modest grave. It's a young computer scientist, paying homage to the intellectual grandfather of her field. She places a small, sleek device on the tombstone, a smartphone, its screen glowing with lines of code. "Thank you," she whispers, "for showing us the way." And as she walks away, the wind seems to carry the faint scratching of a quill on parchment, the eternal sound of human reason striving to make sense of our complex world. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz may have died believing his life's work a failure, but his quest to solve world conflict through logic had only just begun, setting in motion a chain of ideas that would shape the course of human history for centuries to come.